Hello, I want to look now at the theme of racism and secularism. Now, what I suggest is going on is that the West is considering racism, particularly in view here is black versus white racism, um, with a framing of an understanding that there is something called secularism. Secularism, sometimes known or related to liberalism, is what is considered to be of value today. People are assessed according to their secular acumen. This is done in various ways, particularly of course education and someone's ability to interact with, let's say, the physical world. Someone who's good at interacting with the physical world, maybe that's administration, maybe it's technology and science, and maybe it's planning, rationality, is considered someone of value. Someone who's not good at interacting with the physical world or even recognizing the physical world is not considered to be of value. Now we might want to look at the history of this secular position that we in the West these days take as valuable and in many ways take as default and as important. I think it's quite clear if you go back not very far into history, you'll find a time when secularism really wasn't on the scene. In other words, to use today's terminology, people were inherently religious, which is a misleading terminology because they were neither religious nor secular. They were just doing everything as it seemed to make sense to them. So what brought this secularism? Well, let's give a simplified history. The Reformation contributed to it. A break with the European control of the Catholic Church resulted in wars. Those wars were bloody and brutal and sometimes known as religious wars, certainly related to the practice of what we now call religion, Catholic as against Protestant, that ended in the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Now that Peace of Westphalia we can suppose to have been quite a new and radical thing because it marked the end of long bloody battles that people had been determined to win. In other words, it represented a giving up of something that has been this kind of the foundation of life up to that time. Then followed the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment, enabled by a Christian perception of the physical world, gradually enabled scholars to isolate what that physical world consisted of. And then we had people like Darwin, of course, come along who put forward theories, particularly the theory of evolution, that actually seemed to suggest that perhaps all there is the physical world and its various interactions. So until not so many years ago, there was a widespread assumption that secularism was going to be the way forward for everybody, and that so-called religion was going to be in decline. But that assumption really itself went into decline, particularly from or subsequent to the 1970s. Things just didn't seem to work that way. Instead, we had what some would term to be religious revivals, religion not going away. Although Europe seemed secular, even America didn't seem so secular. And of course, even secular Europe, there were still many thriving churches. But the rest of the world particularly was less willing to submit themselves to secularism than had been supposed. Perhaps, for example, in Africa it was assumed that once people had gone through formal education and were literate and had learned science, they put away their superstitious religious side. But they didn't. Now, in harmony with this, with the myth of secularism, we also have the myth of religion. I say the myth of the religion because if we take religion as being essentially that which secularism is not, a complement to secularism, then without secularism you don't have religion either. So as well as a myth of the existence of secularism, we also have this myth of the existence of religion. Now, originally, actually, religion was a practice of Christianity by the religious, in other words, people in monasteries and convents and so forth, in contrast to the secular, who's a priest working out in the parish. Now, that term became appropriated, certainly 18th century and later, to make a distinction between the newly invented secularism and what was considered the alternative secularism, which was to go out of vogue religion. So then what I'm suggesting is that today's anti-racism is inherently tied into this framework of understanding that has emerged in Europe in recent centuries. And in fact then, because anti-racism is considering non-Western races, particularly African black races, wanting to consider them valuable, in effect it does this by considering them to be secular. This means that to be against racism is essentially to be in support of the secular worldview, and that's the problematic of anti-racism that I want to consider. Now, having said that, I suppose that to be the case, I always have to concede that many Western people do not perceive themselves as being pro-secular when they're anti-racist. They don't recognize themselves in this way. To some extent, of course, they don't recognize themselves as secular either, because, of course, there are, particularly in the USA, for example, a lot of very active churches and churchgoers and people engaging in all kind of so-called religious activities. Nevertheless, this to me is helpful in terms of analytically helpful and accurate way of seeing what actually anti-racism is. So this makes anti-racism into kind of a pro-secular ideology, which makes it to me very unhelpful and perhaps even evil, because it means that anti-racism is inherently then pro-secular and anti-religious. So at the moment, culture is analysed in secular terms by the dominant contemporary world. Religion is considered more passé, not the key issue, so secularism is used to evaluate a person. So then what happens is that some people fall short, particularly people who haven't gone through what Western Europeans went through and came out at the other end, considering themselves normal, when actually the influences I've talked about from the Reformation on have kind of taken our brains into a place where they never were before. So what I suggest is that actually theology is a much better evaluator, or would be a much better evaluator of culture than should secularism. I say that somewhat hypothetically and theoretically because today this secularism is so dominant, but it does make a lot of sense to me. I mean, if theology becomes the means of evaluation, then we become subject to the grace of God, rather than the judgmentalism of, does this person function properly secularly? The radical love of God for mankind then is a means on which we evaluate people. Are they loved? And of course we know that they are loved, and God essentially has a love for all people, Jews and Greeks, Gentiles and so forth. Then the basis for evaluating a person is no longer their capability, perhaps basically at economic productivity or rational thought, but the Bible. And I should say the Bible is a much more complex and much more subtle document than would be many of the alternatives that are these days put forward as kind of the secular grounds for doing things. So rather than an economic and rational evaluation of what a person is or ought to be, then we ought to have a biblical and theological evaluation. The problem with this, of course, would be that then we're doing down economics and economic and material productivity. So what does this imply? for industry, for business, is it even ever going to be taken seriously when its implications seem to be very quickly negative? In practice, of course, this idea that people are better evaluated theologically or through the Bible than they are through secularism is not a new idea. There are booming churches, say in Europe, particularly of immigrants, and immigrants find those church contexts often to be a place to feel at home. If we go outside of Western Europe, in the homelands of these people, then we have a phenomenal global spread of the church and of Christianity, certainly in many parts of Africa, where outside of the remit of Islam, Christianity, the Bible, the salvation in Christ are re-announced everywhere, constantly by a wide variety of churches, but the one basic core message regarding the love of God, and we need to believe in that love of God. So people have already made the choice for that as a basis for self-evaluation and evaluation of others rather than secularism. But this choice, of course, is not recognized in formal circles. Western governments, for example, continue to work on a secular basis, as in theory do governments even in the majority world. So then we have black churches in the West, which is a place for African people to feel at home, and we have similarly actually white churches in Africa, which is a place for white people to feel at home. Now the dynamics are quite different. Black churches are kind of considered legitimate means for people to express themselves, and Europeans tend to just keep a distance. But when white people want to feel at home within Africa, then they're under pressure to bring local Africans on board. So, for example, in South Africa, we have a lot of white-led churches that all want to be interracial, whereas black-led churches just aren't under the same pressure to be interracial. They're basically because whites don't want to join them anyway. But we have this then peculiar contrasting position. So then, according to what seems to me plainly to be the case, if we contrast racism with anti-racism, now to be racist is to be honest in one's evaluation of someone regarding their secular capability. Now, of course, because people's cultures and ways of life affiliated to their appearance, then you get people of a certain appearance who are expected not to have certain secular acumen. For example, Africa never went through the Reformation and the religious wars and Enlightenment and so forth that Europe did. So, of course, amongst African people, learning of English and European languages doesn't instantly transform their way of life. So they also, as a group, as an ethnic identity, generally do not have the kind of secular functionality, rationality and economic thinking and material perception that Western Europeans have. Now, anti-racism then is denying this truth. Anti-racism seems to me a kind of just a mythical thing that is determined to ignore the complexity of human cultural nature and insist that, of course, all people are, in a secular way, broadly, equally competent. This makes religion into kind of a vestigial thing, an add-on. And this is how much of Western academia and Western scholarship and Western media these days functions. It assumes that there's a basic secular person and that what is added to that is religion is kind of superfluous. And both of these, of course, are basically wrong positions. Now, what I want to suggest is that this kind of secular identity is not what counts. What counts is the grace of God. And following the grace of God is extended to all of us. So then I propose that we shift evaluation of people away from this very destructive, divisive and untrue secular basis for evaluation to a helpful theological evaluation, which would transform the whole anti-racist scene. And as we transform the anti-racist scene, we undermine the justification for secularism today as a universal. Then the secular people come to be seen as what they are, a peculiar people being who they are due to particular history. And we need to work out what will their role in the globe be in today and in the future. And they have been very dominant. Europeans have been very dominant. Now, apparently the Chinese have learned a great deal from them and have also acquired this capability of domination. Is that really helpful? These are deep philosophical but also theological questions that we need to address, and will get us away from the kind of racist or not racist binary. God bless. Bye for now.